The fluorescent lights hummed above Mercy General's ICU like a mechanical beehive, steady and endless. Natalie Hayes moved through the ward at 6:44 a.m., before the day shift arrived, before the doctors made their rounds, before anyone could watch her work closely enough to ask questions. She'd learned invisibility the way other people learned languages, through repetition, through necessity, through 5 years of practice. Her hands moved with the precision of someone who'd once held lives together in ways the hospital never needed to know. For lines threaded smooth as silk. Oxygen masks adjusted with the competence of muscle memory that ran deeper than any nursing school certification. She checked a patient's ventilator settings, checking the mode, the pressure support, the PEEP at 8 centimeters, and made a notation on the chart without speaking. The cardiac monitor beeped its steady rhythm. Everything was data. Everything was information. Pain was data. Vital signs were data. The small tremor in her hands when an alarm blared too loud, that was also data, and it was data she'd learned to hide. Room for 12 would be her assignment today. That was what the charge nurse had said during handoff, sliding a new admit sheet across the desk. Commander Jake Morrison, 42 years old, admitted with shrapnel complications from a recent operation. SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon. Recent deployment. Postoperative wound assessment and infection prophylaxis. Straightforward case. Routine admission. Nothing that required her to do anything but keep her head down and her composure intact. She pulled the chart and read it standing at the medication dispensary, her eyes moving faster than anyone would have noticed. Baghdad service record. 2 deployments. A note in the intake form about recent surgery in theater, complications developing en route. The physician's summary was clinical and distant, the way summaries always were: reduce a human being to complications and comorbidities, strip away everything that made them real, write the rest in boxes and check marks. Then she saw the photograph. It was attached to the back of the admission paperwork, a photocopy of a photocopy, faded almost to nothing. A unit patch. Tan and crimson and gold, the colors bleeding together from repeated copying. The design was unmistakable. She'd seen that same patch on a jacket lining once, sewn there by hands that had trembled while doing the stitching. She'd sewn it into her own jacket lining 5 years ago, tucked it away so carefully that even her ex-husband had never seen it, never asked about it, never noticed the careful way she kept her sleeve positioned so the inside never showed. Her hands went very still. The chart continued to sit in her hands. She continued to breathe. Nobody was watching her. Nobody ever was. That was the entire point of 5 years at Mercy General, to be the kind of nurse that doctors looked through instead of at, the kind of person who blended into the beige walls and the antiseptic smell, the kind of competent, reliable, silent presence that got the work done without drawing attention. She photographed the admission paperwork with her phone, tucked the chart back where it belonged, and finished her medication checks. The ventilator in room 408 needed a tube repositioning. She could hear the slight change in the pressure gradient through the tubing, a sound most nurses wouldn't have noticed. She made the adjustment. The numbers on the monitor normalized. She noted it and moved on. Dr. Hargrove arrived at 7:15 a.m., before most of the day's shift, which was typical. He liked the ICU during the quiet hours when he could establish the terms of engagement, when he could walk through the ward like he owned it, which in his mind he absolutely did. His white coat was pristine. His tie was silk. His shoes were polished to a shine that suggested a personal shoeshiner somewhere in Raleigh whose sole job was maintaining that level of gleam. He moved with the kind of confident physicality that came from never having been told no by anyone who mattered. Natalie was adjusting the bed height for a patient in room 410, checking the pressure points where the patient lay, making sure nothing was developing into a decubitus ulcer. Hargrove passed without looking at her. That was fine. That was ideal. She preferred not to be seen. Hayes. His voice reached her from the doorway. Room for 12 assessment. I want it done before the day shift arrives. Full vitals, wound inspection, infection assessment. And keep the notes clinical. I'm not interested in your subjective observations about his emotional state. The way he said it, subjective observations about his emotional state, made it clear that he saw nursing assessment as something between guessing and making things up. Natalie turned and nodded once. "Yes, doctor." The words came out soft, deferential, exactly the way they should. She'd practiced this voice for 5 years. It was a different voice from the one she used to use, a lighter voice, a smaller voice. A voice that asked instead of commanded. "When would you like the chart updated?" "Before rounds. I don't need to spend time deciphering your handwriting later." He was already moving past her, already finished with the conversation, already moving on to the next assertion of territorial control. This was how Hargrove worked. He established dominance through dismissal. He made people feel small by treating them like they'd already left the room. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as he disappeared down the corridor. Natalie finished with room for 10 and made her way to 412. Commander Morrison was already awake. He was sitting partway up in bed, the mattress adjusted so he could see the door, which was the posture of someone whose body had learned to always maintain sight lines. His left shoulder was heavily bandaged, the shrapnel had come through the anterior deltoid and into the soft tissue beneath, close enough to the subclavian artery to have required immediate surgical intervention. The bandaging was fresh, which meant the surgery had been recent, probably within the last 48 hours. Postoperative day 2, maybe 3. He had the pale look of blood loss, the careful breathing of someone managing pain without showing it, and the kind of absolutely still watchfulness that came from years of training to remain unnoticed. "Morning, Commander." Natalie's voice was quiet, professional, exactly the right tone for a nurse doing a routine assessment. "I'm Natalie, your primary nurse today. I'm going to check your vitals and take a look at your shoulder, if that's all right." He nodded. His eyes moved to her face, stayed there for a moment in a way that felt longer than it probably was. "You local?" His voice was rough, still recovering from whatever sedation and intubation the operation had required. "Raleigh native." She was already reaching for the blood pressure cuff, sliding it around his right arm with steady hands. 23 years in the area. Originally from South Carolina. USMC. He watched her face. "No." The cuff inflated, 134/88, not bad for immediate post-operative recovery, reasonable pain control. "Just nursing school and civilian life." "You move like military." He said it conversationally, the way someone might mention the weather. "Your posture. The way you check the room before you enter. The order you're doing things in. It's not random. It's trained." Natalie removed the cuff, made a notation on the chart, and didn't answer immediately. The telemetry monitor showed his heart rate at 74, steady sinus rhythm, good oxygen saturation at 97% on room air. Everything was stable. Everything was fine. She checked his temperature, 98.6, exactly normal, and noted it. "My father served," she said finally. It was close enough to the truth. It was partial truth. Partial truth was what she'd perfected over 5 years. Morrison nodded as though that explained something. "He infantry. Navy." She was already moving to the shoulder dressing, checking the edges, looking for any signs of seepage, infection, compromised bandaging. The surgical site looked clean. Hemostasis was intact. The sutures were secure. She had the assessment done in 90 seconds, her hands moving with the kind of economy of motion that came from having done this 10,000 times before. "My dad kept something," Morrison said. His eyes had gone distant, the way eyes go when they're remembering something from a long time ago, something that lived in the part of memory that stays sharper than the present day. "From when I was a kid. In Iraq. There was an incident. A bombing. Market area. I was there with a contractor, my mom was doing NGO work. Contractor's son. I was 8 years old." Natalie's hands continued their work. Notation. Temperature check. Her voice came out exactly the way it should, professional, empathetic, interested in a patient's well-being without being intrusive. That must have been frightening. She was arranging the dressing supplies, keeping her movements visible, keeping everything within the scope of normal nursing care that could be explained if anyone was watching. It was. I don't remember most of it clearly. Head trauma probably, the doctors said later. Concussion at minimum. He paused. His breathing was still careful around the pain of the shoulder. But I remember someone. A medic. Someone who was carrying me. Shielded me. Got me away from the secondary blast radius. Probably saved my life and my father's both, if I'm honest about the situation assessment. Natalie was washing her hands at the sink, keeping her back to him, keeping her face neutral in case it decided to betray her. 20 years. That was how long it had been. 20 years since Baghdad. 20 years since a marketplace in Sadr City and a child wedged under her body while the second blast went off, her arms wrapped around him, her vest taking shrapnel that should have gone into his small spine. Did you ever find them? Her voice was perfectly steady. The medic. Been looking for 5 years now. No luck. I had a unit patch. My father kept it. Sewn into his jacket lining. Morrison shifted slightly, and she could hear the small sound of pain he made, trying to hide it. Beautiful work on the stitching. Whoever did it knew how to handle needle and thread like a surgeon. I've tried to track down the patch origin, had it analyzed, traced the unit markings. But records are sketchy from that operation. Chain of custody got broken somewhere. And the medic was in the wind by the time I had the language skills and the resources to actually look. Natalie dried her hands with a paper towel and turned back to face him. Her composure was intact. Her voice was soft. I hope you find them, sir. People like that deserve to know they made a difference. They do. He was watching her again, that long assessing look. I'd give a lot to say thank you to whoever pulled me out of there. She nodded once and completed her notes. Everything was documented. Vital stable. Wound assessment normal. Pain level self-reported at 4 out of 10, manageable. She made the final notation and closed the chart. Dr. Hargrove will do round in about an hour. If you need anything before that, you use that call button. Any changes, any increase in shoulder pain, any bleeding, any fever, anything feels off, you press it immediately. Don't wait. Roger that. He smiled slightly. You run a tight operation, Natalie. She left room for 12 with the chart in her hands and didn't stop moving until she was back at the nurse's station, where the day shift was starting to arrive, where nobody was looking at her, where she could exist in the space between acknowledgement and invisibility. The unit patch was still in her locker. She'd checked it exactly 316 times in 5 years, always alone, always in the early morning, always with the door closed. She knew every stitch. She'd done every stitch herself, by hand, 20 years ago, using a field kit and hands that had been trying to hold something together. Not just a patch. Not just fabric. The only proof it had ever happened, sewn into the lining of a jacket she kept folded at the bottom of a closet in a house where nobody ever asked questions. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she recognized the eyes. Even with the scar tissue, even with 2 decades of becoming a man, even with the specific kind of hardened composure that only came from training and deployment and surviving things that shouldn't be survivable, she recognized those eyes. And she'd just lied to his face about civilian life, about her father's Navy service, about every single thing that mattered. Hargrove approached the nurse's station at 7:52 a.m., right on schedule, his white coat pristine and his jaw set in the expression of someone who was about to establish dominance through precision and dismissal. He didn't acknowledge her. He simply picked up the charts in order and began his rounds, his presence making the fluorescent light seem even brighter, his authority filling the space like something that had mass and weight and was actively pushing everyone else toward the margins. Natalie opened Morrison's chart to make final notes before he arrived, and her hands, those hands that never trembled, those hands that held steadiness like a weapon, hesitated for exactly 1 second. It was enough. That hesitation, 1 second, maybe less, was all room for 12 needed to fall apart. The monitor beeped its steady rhythm above the bed where Mrs. Castellano lay, 63 years old, post-op hip replacement, and slipping somewhere nobody wanted to follow. Her eyes had that look. The unfocused drift that meant something inside was changing, breaking, closing. Altered mental status at 2:36 p.m. on a Tuesday. Natalie had seen it 1,000 times across 1,000 beds. She'd held the hand of a woman whose husband didn't recognize her anymore. She'd watched the light dim in eyes that used to hold entire universes. This was the moment when seconds became hours, became forever, and most people didn't understand the language being spoken. But Natalie did. Dr. Hargrove stood at the foot of the bed, reading the chart with the kind of focus that meant he wasn't actually reading anything. He was performing. 3 family members crowded the corner: daughter, son-in-law, a grandson in a baseball cap who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. The room smelled like antiseptic and fear, that particular flavor of hospital air when bodies start making decisions nobody voted for. Natalie approached quietly, the way she did everything, her voice pitched low so it wouldn't startle anyone into false reassurance. "Doctor, I think we need a stat CT," she said. Her mental status has been declining since the morning medications. She's confused about time, place. The pain management is adequate. This is neuro, not comfort. The room didn't change temperature. The fluorescent lights didn't flicker. But something did. Something shifted in the air like a bird recognizing a cat. Hargrove's eyes came up from the chart. His jaw moved once, twice, then settled into a smile that had nothing to do with kindness. He turned to the family. Not to Natalie. To them. "Nurses who overstep their training need retraining," he announced, his voice the kind of loud that fills rooms and crushes small things. "This is why we have medical degrees and they don't. The patient is post-operative and experiencing normal confusion. Her vitals are stable. Nothing here suggests neuro-compromise." The daughter's face went red. The son-in-law looked at his shoes. The grandson kept staring at something on his phone. Natalie took one measured breath, the kind you take when your lungs remember how to hold pressure, when your ribs remember how to cage what needs staying caged. Her jaw tightened. Just a millimeter. Just enough to hold everything in place. She didn't flinch. Didn't blink. Didn't say another word. She had learned long ago that the best response to a man like Hargrove was silence so complete it could suffocate. She left the room. Walked back to the nurse's station. Charted the vital signs. Documented her concern. Everything official. Everything on the record. Everything that would be forgotten by morning. But it wasn't morning that mattered. It was 4:52 p.m. when another physician, Dr. Brenner from neurology, who had no investment in hierarchy or ego, ordered the scan at the daughter's insistence. The CT came back 17 minutes later. Subdural hematoma. Right side. Small but active. The kind of bleed that moves slow enough to hide and fast enough to kill. Mrs. Castellano went to the OR at 5:40 p.m. and didn't wake up until the following evening. When she did, she knew her daughter's name. She knew the year. She knew where she was. Hargrove never mentioned Natalie's suggestion. Never acknowledged it. Never apologized or commended or recognized. Instead, something worse happened. He started calling her Florence in staff meetings. Just that. Florence. One word, delivered with a pause that made it an entire sentence of contempt. "Florence here thinks she went to medical school," he'd say while reviewing charts. The other doctors would smile. Small, careful smiles. "Florence, perhaps you could explain why you think physicians need your diagnostic input." Another smile. More careful than the last. By Friday, the break room exile had begun. Hargrove didn't organize it overtly. He simply mentioned, so casually, so concerned, to 3 nurses during lunch that he'd heard through the grapevine about medication errors on Natalie's shift. "Of course, nothing confirmed," he'd said. "I'm sure it's just communication breakdown." But I wanted to give you a heads up. For patient safety. Communication breakdown. The phrase moved through the break room like spilled coffee soaking into paper towels. By Monday, when Natalie sat down at the table where she'd sat for 3 years, something shifted. The nurses gathered their trays. Not angrily. Not loudly. They simply stood, Jennifer first, then Marcus, then the travel nurse from Cincinnati, and they left. They moved to the table by the window. They didn't look back. She was alone by 1:15 p.m. Every day after that, the same ritual. She'd sit. They'd leave. Once, Jennifer forgot her badge on the table. She turned back to get it, saw Natalie, and her face went through something complicated before she grabbed it and turned away. Natalie kept her hand steady around her coffee mug because if she didn't, someone would see them shake, and shaking was the same as admitting weakness, and weakness was the same as admitting they'd broken something she'd spent 5 years carefully holding together. She ate by the window and watched rain streak the glass in patterns that looked almost like coordinates. Routes out. Escape vectors. Muscle memory kept her cataloging exits even though she'd learned that some roads only led to different kinds of boxes. Then came Thursday at 8:07 a.m. The unit board near the nursing station, the one where they posted holiday schedules and CEU announcements, now held a printed page in official letterhead. Natalie saw it before the morning huddle. Before anyone could warn her. Before the words settled into what they actually meant. Disciplinary notice, Nurse N. Hayes, insubordination and failure to respect medical authority. The documentation detailed her inappropriate suggestion regarding Mrs. Castellano, her pattern of overstepping clinical boundaries, and her concerning resistance to supervisory guidance. Hargrove had signed it. The hospital administrator had signed it. It was laminated. Permanent. Public. 12 staff members walked past it that morning. She watched their eyes slide over it like oil on water. Nobody said anything. Nobody said anything because saying something would require acknowledging the thing on the wall that said her name and her failure and her stepping out of line, and in hospitals, in the careful hierarchies of medicine, you don't acknowledge those things. You just adjust your distance from the person they're about. You stand a little farther away. You make sure nobody connects you to her mistakes. Natalie read it 3 times. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects dying slowly in a jar. Her vision narrowed, something her body did automatically when threat assessment protocols kicked in. Threat. Hargrove. Threat. The board. Threat. Her own name in print, documenting her failure to obey. Her hands were steady when she reached up to touch the laminated page. Muscle memory. Combat deployment protocols. The tremor didn't show until later, when she was alone, and even then it wasn't fear. It was restraint. She turned and saw Hargrove across the hall outside his office. He was watching. Waiting. He smiled. She wiped the single tear that escaped, just one, just enough to acknowledge the moment without surrendering to it, and she met his eyes. Really met them. The way she hadn't been taught to do as a civilian. The way she'd learned in a marketplace in Baghdad where you had to show weakness without breaking, had to acknowledge the reality of losing without disappearing into it. I've seen what real leadership looks like, Doctor, she said quietly. Her voice had dropped an octave. And this isn't it. He didn't flinch. Didn't break eye contact. Just kept smiling like a man who'd already won, who was already making the phone calls that would cement it, who had no idea that the woman standing in front of him had trained for 20 years to survive things far worse than his disappointment. But that wasn't the worst part. Commander Morrison's fever spiked at 3:56 a.m. 104.2 degrees. Natalie saw it on the monitor bank before she saw the patient, before the red alert scrolled across his vital signs like a warning written in blood. She was 3 minutes into her shift, still hanging her jacket in the break room when the attending paged her to ICU bed 7. Not a request. Not even a suggestion. The tone meant someone's oxygen was dropping, and they needed hands that didn't shake. She'd been avoiding Morrison's room since Dr. Hargrove arrived at dawn 2 days ago. Not physically, that wasn't possible in a 16-bed ICU, but with a distance that felt like drowning in the same tank of water. Watching him breathe from across the unit. Checking his labs when the day shift nurse clocked out. Reading his chart at midnight when the hallways belonged only to fluorescent light and the occasional code team rushing past like ghosts. The shrapnel wounds from his last operation weren't healing right. That's what the intake note said. Cellulitis. Possible deep tissue infection. Fever spikes were normal, expected even, and Natalie had managed post-operative infections for 17 years without blinking. But this fever felt different. It climbed too fast. His chest pain had escalated from the dull ache to can't take a deep breath in 36 hours. The kind of progression that made her spine straighten, her hands move toward her phone before her conscious mind caught up. She pushed through the ICU doors and Morrison was sitting upright in bed, his muscled frame bent forward like a man trying to collapse into himself, trying to make himself smaller so the pain would lose track of him. His wife was asleep in the chair beside him, her head tilted at an angle that would leave her neck screaming. Infant daughter Sarah nestled against her chest, wrapped in a thin hospital blanket. Morrison's eyes found Natalie the moment she rounded the curtain, and for a second, just a fraction of a second, his expression shifted. Recognition flickered there, something older than memory. Then the fever burned it away and he was just another SEAL trying not to show a nurse how much it hurt. "Good morning, Commander." Her voice came out level, professional, the voice she perfected over 5 years of disappearing. "Let's take a look at what we're dealing with." She didn't wait for permission. The monitor showed his heart rate at 118, climbing. His oxygen sat at 92%, not critical yet, but drifting down like a boat losing anchor. She pulled up his chart on the tablet and scanned the overnight notes. Temperature progression, 101.8 at midnight. 102.6 at 2 a.m. 104.2 now. The fever was accelerating, and beneath that data was something else. Something her military training recognized before her nursing degree could organize the words. Muffled heart sounds were documented in the 2 a.m. note. Just a passing mention, almost an afterthought, heart tone slightly difficult to auscultate, suspect post-op swelling. Natalie's hands went cold. Pericardial effusion. Fluid building around the heart. It could happen after surgery, especially with infection as aggressive as this. The fever wasn't just from the shrapnel wound. The infection was spreading. It was surrounding his heart like rising water, squeezing, compressing, making every beat of that organ work 10 times harder. If it progressed, when it progressed, the fluid would keep accumulating until the pressure crushed the heart's ability to fill. Cardiac tamponade. The kind of thing that turned a conscious man into a corpse in minutes if you didn't intervene. She placed her stethoscope against his chest. His wife stirred, eyes opening, watching with the particular exhaustion of military spouses who'd learned long ago that hospitals at 3 a.m. only brought bad news. Morrison tried to smile for her, that reflex soldiers get, that need to reassure even when reassurance was a lie. The heart sounds were muffled. Like listening to a heartbeat through walls. Through water. When did the chest pain start increasing? Natalie asked, already moving to adjust his oxygen delivery. Hour ago, Morrison managed. Maybe 2. Heart attack. Difficulty breathing. Since about midnight. Thought it was just, he didn't finish. Just a SEAL. Just something warriors ignored. She knew that language. She'd spoken it herself for 2 decades. Natalie's jaw tightened. She straightened, her mind already 7 steps ahead, already calculating timelines and surgical availability and the hard mathematics of how long a man could survive without intervention. She turned from the bedside and walked directly to the unit phone. Dr. Hargrove. Now. Before this got worse. Before the clock ran out. The page went out at 4:03 a.m. Urgent. Attending physician requested ICU bed 7. The response came back at 4:24. Dr. Hargrove was in a board meeting. Essential hospital business. He would review the labs and contact her within the hour. Natalie's fingers dug into the edge of the nurse's station. The kind of grip that would leave crescent marks in her palms. An hour. Morrison would be blue-lipped and unconscious in an hour if the tamponade completed. She paged again. Different message. More detailed. Fever. Muffled heart sounds. Possible pericardial effusion pending echo. The attending physician on call came instead. Younger. Careful. The kind of doctor who learned in training that nurses were obstacles and allies depending on the time of day. He listened to Morrison's chest, reviewed the echo request Natalie had already submitted, and then, the pause. The moment when medical training collided with institutional hierarchy. He looked at her. Really looked, meeting her eyes for the first time. "I think we need to echo this," he said quietly. "I already submitted the request," Natalie replied. Stat. Dr. Hargrove is the physician of record, the attending said. Not unkindly. Just factually. The way people stated laws they didn't make. Dr. Hargrove is in a meeting. Then we wait for him to call back. The attending left. Of course he left. You don't challenge the hierarchy when the hierarchy had already decided you were just a nurse, and just a nurse could be managed, could be worked around, could be blamed if something went wrong. It was a strategy that had held medicine in place for 100 years. Don't question authority. Don't step outside your lane. Don't save a life unless a doctor gave you permission to save a life. Morrison's oxygen dropped to 89%. His wife was fully awake now, watching the monitors with the particular awareness of people who'd learned to read vital signs instead of bedside manner. She leaned forward, her hand finding Morrison's chest, and Natalie saw the moment she felt it, that irregularity, that struggle beneath the ribs. Something wasn't right. Something vital was failing. His heart sounds strange, Mrs. Morrison said. Not a question. A statement from someone who'd learned her husband's body the way soldiers learn their weapons. I'm getting the doctors, Natalie said. She left the bedside, moved through the hallway with purpose, found the code team station. They looked up from their coffee and monitors. Need cardio on standby, Natalie told them. Not requested. Not asked. Stated, the way you stated facts that mattered. Possible pericardial tamponade, bed 7. The charge nurse came off her chair. Who's the attending? Hargrove. He's in a board meeting. Then who authorized the alert? I did, Natalie said. He's about to crash. The charge nurse made a call. Not to Hargrove. To the attending cardiologist. It was a boundary that shouldn't be crossed. In another hospital, at another time, it might have ended her. But the cardiologist heard muffled heart sounds, fever spike, respiratory distress, and he didn't ask questions. He said he'd be there in 4 minutes. Natalie returned to Morrison's bedside. For minutes felt like a countdown timer on a bomb. His lips were taking on a pale blue tint, like someone had drained the color from his mouth. His breathing had become shallow, rapid. The monitor showed his heart working hard, beating fast, the rhythm stuttering occasionally like an engine running out of fuel. Mrs. Morrison's grip on her husband's hand looked like she was trying to hold him to the planet by sheer force of will. It's going to be okay, Morrison said to her, and it was the worst line Natalie had ever heard because they both knew it wasn't true. His body knew. She could see it in the way his pupils dilated, in the way his hand trembled, not from fear. From the cascade of adrenaline his sympathetic nervous system was flooding into his bloodstream as it fought to compensate for a heart that was losing room to beat. The cardiologist arrived with an ultrasound machine. No waiting for permission. No consulting the hierarchy. He put the probe against Morrison's chest and the image appeared on screen, the heart, the pericardial sac, the dark collection of fluid surrounding it like an ocean trying to drown the most vital organ in the human body. How much? Natalie asked. The cardiologist's face didn't change. About 400 milliliters. Maybe more. He's in tamponade. We need to drain this now. That's when Dr. Hargrove arrived. He came through the curtain with the unhurried confidence of a man whose authority had never been questioned, whose schedule ran the hospital, whose presence alone was supposed to settle things. His eyes moved across the scene, the cardiologist, the ultrasound, the patient drowning in his own pericardial space, and for just a moment, Natalie saw him process what he was seeing. Then the mask came back. The authority. The control. "What's the diagnosis?" he asked, though the ultrasound was still visible on the monitor behind him. "Pericardial effusion with tamponade physiology," the cardiologist said carefully. "Needs emergency drainage." "How long until cardiothoracic surgery can get him to the OR?" The cardiologist checked his watch. 30 minutes. Maybe more if they're already in a case. Dr. Hargrove looked at Morrison. Really looked at him. At the blue lips. At the struggle for every breath. At a Navy SEAL who was drowning on dry land because fluid was squeezing his heart. "We wait for surgery," Dr. Hargrove said. Not a suggestion. Not a clinical decision. A statement that might have worked if they had time, if Morrison wasn't already showing signs of cardiogenic shock, if the fluid was going to politely stop accumulating while they waited for the proper specialty team. "He's decompensating," the cardiologist said quietly. "If we don't drain this in the next few minutes, surgery is the appropriate intervention. We wait." Natalie watched the argument happen without speaking. It was a dance she'd seen before. The attending versus the specialist. The command authority versus the clinical reality. The problem was Dr. Hargrove held institutional power. The cardiologist held medical certainty. And Morrison held neither. His oxygen was 84% now. His heart rate at 134. The monitor showed electrical activity that didn't match what should be happening, the kind of dissociation that meant his body was running out of ideas, running out of oxygen, running out of time. Natalie reached for her phone. Paged the code team directly. Not a request. Not a suggestion. The cardiologist's eyes met hers across Morrison's bed. Something passed between them, the recognition that certain lines had just been crossed, that hierarchy no longer mattered because a man was dying, and some things transcended authority. "I'll get a needle," the cardiologist said, already moving. "Pericardiocentesis." "Right now." Dr. Hargrove's face went rigid. "That's not your patient. That's not your call." But Natalie was already at the crash cart, pulling supplies. Sterile field. 18-gauge needle. Ultrasound probe for guidance. The equipment moved through her hands like muscle memory, like her body remembered the field hospitals and the chaos and the moments when protocol meant nothing and survival meant everything. The cardiologist was positioning the ultrasound. "Help me get him supine." Morrison was already sliding down in the bed, Mrs. Morrison moving to keep their daughter clear, the entire ICU now silent, watching, understanding without being told that a line had been drawn and crossed. Dr. Hargrove stepped back. Not accepting. Just recognizing that he'd lost this particular battle. The needle was ready. The moment stretched like it was made of amber. Natalie had lived entire decades in moments like this, moments that determined whether someone's next breath was their last one or the first one of whatever came after. She'd been here before. In Baghdad. In the field hospital. With children and soldiers and the weight of life and death balanced on the point of a needle. The code team rushed through the door, and nobody even saw them arrive. Morrison's monitor screamed. 3 sharp beeps, then the flatline scream that stops time inside an ICU. Natalie was 3 doors down restocking a crash cart when the sound punched through the overhead, the specific pitch that means cardiac arrest, not the routine alarm, the one that makes your hands move before your brain catches up. She didn't think. Senior Chief Petty Officer never thought. She moved. She was through Morrison's door in 8 seconds. The room smelled like antiseptic and fear sweat, the thick metallic tang of blood pressure dropping fast. Morrison's lips had turned the color of slate. Not white. Slate blue. His eyes were open, but the pupils had already started to dilate, the look of a body checking out before the brain got permission. His wife stood frozen against the wall, one hand pressed to her mouth. Dr. Hargrove was there, calm as a surgeon in a photograph, already pointing toward the door. "Nurse, get out. Cardiothoracic is being called down now. We wait for the specialists. That's protocol." Natalie's eyes locked onto the cardiac monitor. 70/40. Dropping. His jugular veins were distended like rope, his breath coming in gasps. One look at the chest X-ray on the screen and she knew. Pericardial effusion. Blood pooling around his heart like a slow fist, squeezing it tighter with every beat. Another minute and the heart stops beating altogether. "No," she said. The word came out flat. Command voice. Not the deferential nurse voice Hargrove expected. Cardiac tamponade. He's crashing now. Hargrove's face hardened. "I said we wait. There's a protocol for this, and you are not." Natalie was already moving to the crash cart. She grabbed the spinal needle, 14 gauge, sterile, the kind meant for lumbar puncture but perfect for the job at hand. Her hands were steady. They always were. 3 tours taught her that panic is a luxury, and dead people don't need luxuries. "Step back, doctor." It wasn't a request. It was a command, delivered in a voice that had ordered men through fire. Hargrove opened his mouth. Closed it. Something in her presence made the air pressure change, made him understand that this was not a debate. Natalie swabbed Morrison's chest with iodine, the sharp medicinal smell cutting through the fierce sweat, and found the 5th intercostal space, midclavicular line. This was muscle memory. This was Baghdad, 2004, a marketplace after the bomb, her hand steady while chaos erupted around her. She'd done this before on soldiers bleeding out internally, and she'd do it again. Morrison's wife made a sound, half prayer, half sob. The needle went in. There was resistance, then the sudden give of penetration. Natalie advanced the catheter another half-inch, watching for the flash. There. Blood. Dark venous blood pooling around the needle hub. She'd found the pericardial sac. 200 ccs of blood was crushing his heart like a closed fist, and she had 90 seconds to drain it before the fist clenched one more time and stopped everything. The blood came back through the needle, gravity and pressure doing the work. The hiss of air escaping. She kept one eye on the monitor while her left hand steadied the needle, kept it from migrating, kept the angle perfect. 100 ccs out. His blood pressure was still dropping. 150 out. Still dropping. 200 ccs. The monitor beeped once. Twice. Then the rhythm normalized. Sinus rhythm. Beautiful, impossible, alive sinus rhythm. His color changed. Just like that. The slate blue receded from his lips like a tide. Pink came back. Actual human pink. His wife gasped, a sound like prayer answered, and his eyes cleared. He was breathing. Really breathing. Not gasping. Breathing. Natalie secured the needle in place with tape and turned to the monitor. Blood pressure 110/68. Heart rate 102. Stable. His wife was crying, reaching for his hand, saying his name over and over like a word that needed repeating to be true. Dr. Hargrove's face had gone through 3 colors, red to white to a gray that suggested he was calculating distances to the door. He stood motionless for exactly 3 seconds. Then he turned and walked out. Natalie knew what that walk meant. It was the walk of a man whose position just collapsed. A man who'd been frozen, and a nurse, a nobody in scrubs, had saved his patient while he stood uselessly watching. Hargrove was not the kind of man who accepted that. He was the kind of man who burned it down rather than acknowledge it. Within the hour, his calls were already out. Natalie heard about them through the break room gossip chain, the way information always moves in a hospital, traveling on breaths and glances and the professional courtesy of people who work next to each other and know which ones to fear. He'd called his brother-in-law, a board member. He'd called risk management. He'd already begun spinning the narrative, unsanctioned procedure, scope of practice violation, liability nightmare. By the next morning, the consultant had arrived. A lean man with a briefcase and the smile of someone paid hourly to destroy people. Hargrove had primed the staff. Suddenly 3 nurses were willing to testify that they'd seen her act independently before, that she didn't always respect the chain of command, that she was unstable. The same nurses who'd been eating lunch with her 2 days ago. The cardiac team had arrived at Morrison's door that morning and found him stable, smiling weakly at his wife. Cardiologist took one look at the procedural note and said, "Perfect placement." Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. Then he looked confused when he saw it wasn't Hargrove's signature. By 3 p.m., Natalie was in the HR office on the 3rd floor. No legal representation offered. The form was already printed, termination for cause. Practicing outside her scope. Creating liability exposure. Failure to follow chain of command protocols. "We have no choice," the HR director said, not meeting her eyes. The board was very clear. "Your badge is deactivated effective immediately." Natalie didn't argue. She'd spent 5 years learning not to argue. She went to her locker and emptied it. The cracked Navy mug from her first deployment, the one that somehow survived 3 tours and 1,000 moves. A dying succulent in a ceramic pot that her son Eli had given her. He tried to keep it alive, but they both knew failure when they saw it approaching. A photograph in a plastic frame, her surgical team from Baghdad, 23 of them in desert camouflage, standing in front of a sandbagged medical tent. She'd circled the faces of the ones who didn't come home, a black marker on the glass. 7 circles. Half the team. Half the people in that photograph had been carried out under fire, and she'd held their hands while they died, and she'd kept the photograph anyway because forgetting them wasn't an option. She packed it all in a cardboard box from the supply closet. The rain started as she walked to the bus stop, the kind of rain that comes straight down without apology. She stood under the bus shelter with the cardboard box balanced on her hip, watching the water drip through the gap in the roof, watching the streaks of black ink on the photograph blur as the box absorbed moisture. A taxi passed. She didn't have $40 for a taxi. She had $237 in her checking account and 17 years of experience that apparently meant nothing. The rain kept falling. The bus would come in 11 minutes. She stood and waited, holding the box like it contained something fragile, something worth carrying through the rain. Around her, the city moved on, people in dry cars, people safe in buildings, people who didn't know they were standing next to the person who'd just saved a man's life and been fired for it. Nobody looked at her. Nobody ever did. That had always been the point. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the silence. The way her phone stayed quiet. The way nobody from Mercy General called to ask if she was okay, or needed anything, or wanted to testify that she'd saved a man's life with her hands. The way her ex-husband's voicemail was full when she tried to leave a message. The way her son Eli, 17 and caught in the middle of his parents' distance, didn't answer her text until 2 a.m. "Mom, call me when you're ready to talk." She wasn't ready to talk. She was standing at a bus stop in the rain, holding a cardboard box, wondering if leaving the Navy 5 years ago had been the mistake all along. Or if trying to come back was. If staying invisible had been the right choice, and stepping into the light had been the catastrophe. The bus arrived at 10:44 p.m. with the hiss of air brakes and the smell of diesel exhaust mixing with rain. She got on. Sat in the back. Watched Raleigh slide past the window in the dark. The bus doors hissed shut behind her. Rain hammered the windshield like accusations. Natalie sat in the back, watching Raleigh slide past in the dark, the cardboard box balanced on her lap, cracked Navy mug inside, dying succulent, photograph of her Baghdad team. Half of them gone now. She pressed her forehead against the cold window and didn't let herself think about tomorrow. The next morning came anyway. Eli burst through the hospital administrator's office door at 9:07 a.m. like a breaching charge, wild-eyed, rain still dripping from his hoodie. His 17-year-old voice cracked with fury and something else, pride, maybe. Recognition. "Mom, they need to see these," he shouted, dumping the shadow box onto the polished conference table with enough force to make the hospital CEO flinch. Medals cascaded across the mahogany like shrapnel. Bronze Star with Valor. Purple Heart. Navy Commendation Medal. Each one caught the overhead light and held it, objects that had traveled 20 years through wars and silence and a cardboard box under a teenage boy's bed, waiting. The CEO stared. The trembling nurse administrator, the one who'd read Natalie the termination papers, went absolutely pale. And Commander Morrison, still in the wheelchair beside the CEO because they'd wanted him present for this conversation about liability and settlement figures, made a sound like something breaking inside his chest. "Senior Chief Petty Officer Hayes," he said. His voice didn't crack. It fractured. "That's who you are." It wasn't a question. The nurse administrator's hand shook as she reached for the file Eli had brought, the official military record, the one that had been sealed, the one Morrison's legal team had somehow accessed through channels that didn't ask permission. She cleared her throat twice before she could speak. 3 combat deployments, she whispered, reading like she was testifying at someone's funeral. Field surgical team leader. 17 lives saved under fire. Purple Heart twice over. Her voice dropped further. Recommendation for Navy Cross, rescind pending. She stopped. Looked up at Natalie. Pending what? Morrison leaned forward in that wheelchair, and the movement had the weight of armor moving. His eyes had the quality of someone looking at a ghost that had just become solid. "She carried me," he said, each word deliberate as a heartbeat. 2 miles through a kill zone in Baghdad. I was 8 years old. The marketplace bombing on April 14, 2004. My father was a contractor doing site assessments. The blast came from the north side, and she was there, not a SEAL yet, just a field medic with everybody else running the other direction, and she grabbed me and she ran. She ran with me through 2 miles of active fire zones because my father was gone and she wouldn't leave a child. The silence had weight. It pressed down on everyone in the room like depth charges. Morrison continued, his jaw tight, his hands gripping the wheelchair arms with the kind of strength that came from being trained to break things. "That faded patch you asked me about, Senior Chief? The one my father kept sewn in his jacket lining? I spent 5 years looking for the medic who wore it. 5 years. I became a SEAL because of you. I went back to Baghdad 17 times because I was looking for a name that wasn't written anywhere." He swallowed. "And you were just sitting in room for 12, fixing for lines and getting destroyed by a man who didn't deserve to breathe the same air you do." The CEO opened his mouth. Nothing came out. That's when the IT director walked in, a Marine Corps veteran named Graves with the kind of controlled fury that comes from understanding exactly how much damage had been done. He set a hard drive on the table beside the medals. Dr. Hargrove attempted deletion of security footage captured in the ICU corridor and the staff break room, Graves said, his voice like gravel. Every frame. All 16 conversations between Hargrove and the outside consultant he brought in. All timestamped modifications on the medication incident reports he filed against Senior Chief Hayes. "We recovered everything. Reported it to the State Medical Board 42 minutes ago. Their investigator is en route to Mercy General now." The CEO's face underwent a transformation that would have been fascinating if it wasn't so definitively the moment his career began its controlled descent into rubble. He reached for the phone. Then stopped. Then reached again. "Call legal," he said to no one in particular. "Call, I need." "You need to listen," Morrison said. His voice had dropped to something that sounded like the rotor wash of a Black Hawk at altitude. "My wife is a naval attorney. She's been on the phone with Judge Advocate General's office since yesterday morning. Your malpractice carrier suspended Dr. Hargrove's coverage pending investigation exactly 90 minutes ago. Your board member who voted to hire the outside consultant? His Hargrove's brother-in-law. He resigned this morning. The North Carolina Medical Board has evidence of patient endangerment and evidence tampering. 3 nurses have provided recorded conversations showing the medication error allegations were fabricated. And you're about to offer Senior Chief Hayes full reinstatement with back pay, a formal apology, and enough of a settlement to fund her son's education and establish a veteran mental health fund in this hospital's name. It wasn't a request. It was a command structure being invoked, and everyone in the room understood exactly who held the rank, even though only one person was wearing a uniform, and she was the one sitting quietly by the window, her hand resting on her son's shoulder, watching the man who'd tried to destroy her understand that he'd just detonated his entire life. What happened next didn't stay contained in that office. It spilled through Mercy General like a contagion. By noon, Hargrove's license was under investigation. By end of business, his suspension was in effect. His attorney started negotiating before sunset, trying to keep him out of criminal charges for evidence tampering. The negotiation lasted 3 days. The criminal charges were dropped. The medical license revocation wasn't. 6 months passed. Morrison recovered completely. The pericardiocentesis had saved not just his life but his ability to return to command. He submitted his after-action report documenting the delay in care, Hargrove's refusal to act on clear symptoms, the moment when a cardiac tamponade nearly became a death because a man with a title had more authority than a woman with a clue. National news picked it up. Cable networks ran it for a week straight, decorated Navy medic fired for saving SEAL commander's life. Hospitals across the country started retraining their hierarchies. Medical boards in 7 states launched their own investigations into whether nurses were being silenced by defensive physicians. Dr. Hargrove, his license revoked, his credibility atomized, took a job selling insurance from a folding table in a strip mall parking lot on the north side of Raleigh. The banner behind him peeled in the rain. Clients didn't return. He sat there anyway, every weekday, because the alternative was acknowledging what he'd become. Then came Veterans Day. Camp Lejeune. The ceremony hall with its polished floor and flags and 200 naval personnel in dress uniforms that looked like they were holding the light itself. Natalie Hayes stood at attention in her navy dress blues for the first time in 5 years, and the fit was still perfect because she'd kept her frame. Discipline doesn't atrophy, it just waits. Her uniform hung on her like a skin she'd grown into and out of and was reclaiming. Gold insignia. Service ribbons marching across her chest like a biography written in color. And there, standing beside her in his commander's whites with the weight of rank and gratitude in his shoulders, was Jake Morrison. He raised his hand. He pinned the unit patch to her shoulder, the same design as the faded scrap his father had kept, now new again, now official, now undeniable. The patch went into place with a small sound like air escaping, like breath held for 5 years finally being released. Eli sat in the front row. His mother's son. He was seeing her fully for the first time, not the nurse who worked double shifts to avoid sleeping, not the woman who froze at loud noises, not the version of herself she'd learned to bury. He was seeing the warrior. The person who'd run 2 miles through gunfire carrying another person's child. He was watching her be recognized, and his eyes were doing that thing they did when he was trying not to cry. Morrison stepped to the podium. The room went silent, not the absence of sound, but the presence of attention, the kind of quiet that belongs in spaces where important things are being said. Senior Chief Petty Officer Hayes taught me something when I was 8 years old and didn't know it, he said, and his voice carried through the hall like it was carrying rank. Courage isn't loud. It's the medic who runs toward gunfire when everyone else is running away. It's the nurse who risks everything because it's right, not because it's safe. It's the warrior who fights invisible battles every single day and still shows up to work, still holds patients' hands, still gives away pieces of herself to people who don't even know they're being saved. He paused. The flags behind him moved slightly, wind coming through somewhere, or maybe just the pressure of the moment needing release. It's the person who carries the weight of other people's lives and never mentions the scar. That's courage. That's what we're here to honor. The room stood. Not collectively. one person at a time, like someone had given an order that rang through every nervous system in that hall. They stood for 2 minutes. Natalie confirmed it later because she'd been counting without meaning to, and numbers never lied. 2 minutes of standing ovation for someone who'd just been fired from a hospital for being too good at saving people. Outside, through the ceremony hall windows, in a strip mall parking lot across the street, a man in a cheap suit sat at a folding table under a peeling insurance company banner, watching the flags and the salutes and the life he'd burned down, looking for something he couldn't name. A car passed without stopping. Then another. He adjusted his briefcase and checked his phone, which hadn't rung in 38 days. Back inside, Natalie shook hands with the Navy brass, 3 admirals, 2 captains, the JAG officer who'd coordinated the investigation. She accepted their gratitude. She said yes to the requests for her story, no to the book deal offers, maybe to the university fellowship they wanted her to consider. And then Eli was there, his arms around her, and she let herself cry for the first time in 5 years where someone could see it. Not breaking. Just finally allowing herself to be held by someone who loved her while standing in a room full of people who finally understood what she was. Morrison's daughter, 1 year old, inherited her mother's dark eyes and her father's solemn expression, reached for the medals on Natalie's chest, drawn to the light they caught. Morrison's wife smiled, smoothing the baby's hair. "Maybe someday we'll tell her the whole story," she said softly. Natalie looked at the gathered veterans. The next generation. The ones still fighting invisible wars and visible ones. She thought about Room for 12, about the way silence had nearly been her final word, about the woman who'd worked herself into erasure trying to heal while broken. She touched the patch Morrison had pinned to her shoulder, felt the weight of it, the reality of it, the 5 years compressed into a single moment of recognition. "Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns," she said. Her voice was steady. It was the voice of someone who'd finally come home. The camera pulled back through the window, the ceremony inside, badges and flags and the light of being recognized, and the empty folding table outside where a man in a cheap suit was packing briefcase that no one wanted to buy insurance from, and the rain was beginning to fall on both of them equally. The story was ending. The world was continuing. And somewhere between those two truths was where people like Natalie Hayes lived, not in the noise of recognition, but in the quiet satisfaction of having done the right thing when doing it cost everything. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever known something was wrong and been told to stay silent, if you've ever carried someone else's pain so they could survive, you know exactly what Natalie was feeling in that moment. Subscribe for more stories of quiet warriors who changed the world without asking permission. Like this video if you believe nurses deserve better. And comment, what would you have done in Natalie's position? Would you have saved him, or would you have walked away?